The whispers followed Penelope Warren like shadows, slinking between the pews of Willow Creek's only church on a sweltering Sunday in 1878. Even with her eyes fixed firmly on Reverend Holloway's weathered Bible, she could feel their stares burning into her back. Every widow, rancher's wife, and town gossip silently condemning the woman who had arrived 6 months ago with nothing but a small trunk and secrets heavy enough to bow her slender shoulders. Penelope's gloved fingers tightened around her worn hymnal as Mrs. Thatcher's hushed voice carried from 2 rows back. Imagine the audacity, showing her face in the Lord's house after what happened at the Prescott farm. Hot shame colored Penelope's cheeks. The incident at the Prescott farm had been a terrible misunderstanding, but in a town as small as Willow Creek, Wyoming territory, misunderstandings grew into scandals faster than prairie fires. She'd simply been collecting herbs for her remedies, not trespassing or stealing as Mrs. Prescott had claimed when she discovered Penelope near their property line. "Hymn number 215, announced Reverend Holloway, his voice slicing through her thoughts. "Rock of Ages." As the congregation rose, Penelope sensed a presence beside her. The pew creaked under new weight, and a masculine scent of leather, horse, and open prairie filled the space that had been deliberately left empty on either side of her. She kept her eyes forward, not daring to look, though she could see the tall, broad-shouldered figure in her peripheral vision. The congregation's unified singing faltered momentarily as heads turned to witness the audacious act. Someone had willingly sat beside the town pariah. Only when the stranger's deep baritone joined the hymn did Penelope allow herself a sideways glance. Her breath caught at the sight of a man she'd never seen before, tall, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer storm. His hands, holding the hymnal with surprising gentleness, bore the calluses of hard work, and beneath his Sunday best, she could tell he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in the saddle. When the hymn ended and everyone sat, the stranger leaned slightly toward her. "Mighty fine singing, miss," he murmured, offering a smile that creased the corners of his eyes. "Name's Ryder Whitfield, just rode into town yesterday." Penelope felt the weight of 24 stares upon them. "You might reconsider your choice of seating, Mr. Whitfield," she whispered back, her voice barely audible over Reverend Holloway's opening prayer. "Association with me won't do your reputation any favors in Willow Creek." Something like amusement flickered across his face. "Good thing I don't put much stock in reputations then," he replied, and though he turned his attention to the sermon, he made no move to change seats. For the first time in months, Penelope found herself distracted during the service not by the whispers or stares, but by the unexpected kindness of a stranger who didn't know enough to shun her. After the final prayer, Penelope gathered her things quickly, hoping to slip away before the usual gauntlet of cold shoulders and whispered comments. But as she rose, Mrs. Jenkins, the shopkeeper's wife, whose disapproval was matched only by her persistence, blocked her path. "Miss Warren," she said, her voice carrying just loud enough for nearby congregants to hear. "I noticed you gathering flowers by Miller's Creek yesterday. I do hope you aren't planning another of your unusual remedies. You remember what happened to little Tommy Davis after that tonic you gave him." Penelope felt her chest tighten. "Mrs. Jenkins, as I explained, Tommy had a fever that broke naturally. My chamomile tea simply helped him rest. Perhaps in Philadelphia such practices were acceptable, Mrs. Jenkins continued as if Penelope hadn't spoken, "But here in Willow Creek, we trust Dr. Simmons with our ailments. A woman alone with no husband preparing mysterious concoctions. It invites talk." Before Penelope could respond, Ryder Whitfield stepped beside her, his tall frame casting a shadow between the women. "Pardon my interruption, madam," he said, tipping his hat to Mrs. Jenkins with exaggerated courtesy. "But Miss Warren promised to show me the way to the boarding house." "New in town, you understand." Mrs. Jenkins blinked, her righteous momentum halted. "Mr. Whitfield, is it? I believe my husband mentioned you've taken work at the Rockingham Ranch. Yes, madam, head wrangler position. The Millbrooks are a respectable family, she said pointedly, with a disapproving glance at Penelope. I'd be happy to direct you to Mrs. Hudson's boarding house myself. Ryder smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Much obliged, but I've already accepted Miss Warren's kind offer. He turned to Penelope. Shall we? Heart hammering, Penelope nodded and allowed him to escort her from the church, feeling the weight of stairs following them into the bright sunlight. Only when they'd walked a fair distance did she slow her steps. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly. But thank you. Ryder's expression was thoughtful as he studied her. Seems to me a town this size ought to have better things to do than torment a lady. I'm hardly considered a lady in Willow Creek, she replied with a bitter smile, more of a cautionary tale. And what terrible crime did you commit to earn such distinction? Penelope hesitated. The real reason for her pariah status was complicated, tangled in half-truths and misunderstandings. I don't conform to expectations. A serious offense indeed, he said, the corner of his mouth lifting. Well, Miss Warren, I find myself in need of directions regardless. Is there truly a boarding house? Yes, Mrs. Hudson's place, just past the general store. She pointed down the dusty Main Street. But Mr. Whitfield, Ryder, he corrected. Ryder, she conceded. You should know that being seen with me won't do you any favors. Willow Creek has a long memory and limited forgiveness. He studied her for a moment, his gaze direct but not unkind. I've found that people who worry overmuch about what others think rarely accomplish anything worthwhile. He tipped his hat. I hope our paths cross again, Miss Warren. Penelope, she offered, surprising herself. Penelope, he repeated, and something in the way he said her name made her cheeks warm. With a nod, he turned and continued down the street, his long stride unhurried. Penelope watched him go, a strange feeling taking root in her chest, something she hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't until she turned toward her small cottage on the edge of town that she realized what it was. Hope. The next morning, Penelope woke before dawn as always, tending to her small garden where she grew herbs for her remedies. She'd come to Wyoming seeking a fresh start after the scandal in Philadelphia, a scandal that had seen her nursing reputation destroyed and her engagement broken over accusations of impropriety with a patient. The truth had been far less sordid. She'd simply used herbal remedies alongside conventional medicine, a practice her fiancé, a prominent doctor, had found embarrassing and primitive. Willow Creek was supposed to be her chance to build something new, but instead, she'd found the same prejudice and suspicion, just in a smaller pond. As she carefully harvested feverfew for Mrs. Peterson's headache remedy, she heard the unmistakable sound of approaching hoofbeats. Few visitors came to her isolated cottage, and those who did usually arrived furtively at dusk, seeking the very remedies they publicly condemned. She straightened, brushing dirt from her apron as a horse and rider appeared on the path. Even from a distance, she recognized Ryder Whitfield's broad shoulders and the easy way he sat in the saddle. "Good morning," he called, dismounting with fluid grace. He was dressed for ranch work today, denims, work shirt, and a vest that had seen better days with a bandana knotted at his throat. "Mr. Whitfield," she acknowledged, suddenly conscious of her dirt-smudged apron and loose braid. "What brings you out this way?" "Ryder," he reminded her, leading his horse closer. "And I find myself in need of a remedy if you provide such services." She regarded him warily. "What sort of remedy?" He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a bundle of cloth, unwrapping it to reveal a nasty-looking cut across his palm. "Had a disagreement with some barbed wire this morning." Penelope's healer instincts took over. "Come inside, I'll need to clean that properly." Her cottage was small but meticulously kept, with bundles of drying herbs hanging from the rafters and shelves lined with carefully labeled jars. She gestured to a chair at her small table and gathered her supplies, aware of Ryder taking in her modest home. "You know," she said, bringing a basin of water to the table, Dr. Simmons could have tended this in town. Could have, Ryder agreed, wincing slightly as she unwrapped his makeshift bandage. But Millbrook mentioned you had a way with healing. Said his daughter's cough cleared right up after visiting you, though his wife made him swear not to tell anyone they'd come. Penelope's hands stilled momentarily. Mr. Millbrook said that? He's not much for town gossip, Ryder replied, watching as she cleaned his wound. Says he judges folks by their actions, not rumors. She worked in silence for a moment, gently removing dirt from the cut. This will need stitches, she decided. It's deep but clean enough. If he was concerned it didn't show, do what you need to. As she prepared her needle and thread, Ryder spoke again. So, you planning to tell me what really has this town so riled up against you, because I'm having trouble believing it's just about herbal remedies. Penelope's hands remained steady, though her heart skipped. It's a long story. I've got time, he said simply. She took a deep breath, focusing on threading her needle. I came here after difficulties in Philadelphia. I was engaged to a doctor there. When his patient, a prominent man's wife, died under his care, he blamed my herbal supplements. It was easier than admitting his treatment had failed. She began the first stitch, impressed when Ryder barely flinched. The truth was, her condition was beyond anyone's help, but my reputation was ruined, and when I arrived here, it somehow preceded me. That doesn't explain the level of hostility I witnessed yesterday. Penelope tied off the first stitch and began another. Shortly after I arrived, there was an influenza outbreak. Dr. Simmons was overwhelmed, so I offered my help. Several patients recovered under my care, but one, a child, did not. And they blamed you, Ryder surmised. The boy was already failing when they brought him to me, she said quietly. But yes, they blamed me. Then there was the misunderstanding at the Prescott farm and other incidents. Small towns need scapegoats, Mr. Whitfield. I've apparently been elected to serve. She finished the last stitch and began applying a salve of her own making. Keep this clean. I'll give you more salve to take with you, and you should change the bandage daily. Instead of responding to her instructions, Ryder caught her wrist gently. Penelope, he said, his voice low, that's a heavy burden to bear alone. Something in his touch, warm, calloused, and unexpectedly gentle, made her throat tighten. I'm accustomed to it. Maybe you shouldn't have to be. Their eyes met, and for a moment, Penelope couldn't look away from his steady gaze. Then self-preservation reasserted itself, and she withdrew her hand, busying herself with bandaging his palm. What brought you to Willow Creek? She asked, changing the subject. Most people are leaving these small towns, not arriving. A shadow crossed his features. Was rangering down in Texas, decided it was time for a change of scenery. Rangering, you were a Texas Ranger. She tried to reconcile this with the man before her, who seemed more contemplative than the hard-edged lawman she'd heard about. For 7 years, he confirmed. Until last winter. She sensed there was more to the story, but he offered nothing further, and she respected his reticence. After all, she had her own unspoken chapters. When she finished bandaging his hand, he reached into his pocket with his good hand and placed coins on the table. I can't accept payment, she said automatically, his brow furrowed. Why not? You provided a service. Because it would only confirm what they say, that I practice medicine without a license. I help where I can, but I don't charge. That's how you support yourself, by not charging for your skills. He sounded incredulous. Penelope smiled thinly. I have a small inheritance that covers necessities. The garden provides the rest. Ryder studied her for a long moment, then gathered the coins. Well, I'm obliged for the doctoring, even if you won't accept proper payment. He stood, his height more apparent in the small room. Perhaps you'll allow me to repay you another way. That's not necessary, Sunday, he said. After church, I'll take you to dinner at the hotel restaurant. Penelope stared at him, momentarily speechless. You can't be serious. I rarely joke about food, Miss Warren. The hotel restaurant is in the center of town. Everyone would see. That's the general idea, he replied, a challenge in his eyes. Unless you're concerned for my reputation rather than your own. It was so unexpected, so contrary to everything she'd experienced in Willow Creek, that Penelope found herself laughing a rusty sound she barely recognized as her own. "Mr. Whitfield, are you using your injury to coerce me into a dinner engagement?" His slow smile made her pulse quicken. "Is it working?" Against every ounce of hard-won caution, Penelope found herself nodding. "Yes," she said softly, "I suppose it is." Over the next few days, Penelope told herself repeatedly that accepting Ryder's invitation had been foolish. She even composed a note declining the dinner, but each time she prepared to deliver it to Mrs. Hudson's boarding house, something stopped her. Perhaps it was the memory of his smile, or the way he deliberately sat beside her when everyone else had maintained their distance. By Sunday morning, she found herself taking extra care with her appearance, selecting her second-best dress, a modest blue cotton that brought out her eyes, and arranging her hair more carefully than she had in months. The whispers in church were, if possible, even worse than the previous week. News of Ryder's visit to her cottage had spread, embellished with each telling. By the time Penelope slipped into her usual pew, the story had morphed into something quite scandalous indeed. This time, when Ryder joined her, the congregation's reaction was less surprise and more outrage. Mrs. Jenkins actually made a small huffing sound, and behind them, someone murmured something about birds of a feather. "Good morning," Ryder said quietly, seemingly oblivious to the stir he was causing. His bandaged hand was proof that at least part of the rumors were true. "You're determined to ruin yourself in this town, aren't you?" Penelope whispered as the service began. "I find I'm not particularly concerned with Willow Creek's approval," he replied, his shoulder warm against hers in the narrow pew. "Though I am concerned about whether you still plan to join me for dinner." Despite everything, she felt her lips curve upward, against my better judgment. The service passed in a blur, Penelope aware of little beyond Ryder's steady presence beside her and the weight of dozens of disapproving stares. When Reverend Holloway finally delivered the benediction, she steeled herself for the gauntlet of whispers and cold shoulders. What she hadn't prepared for was Dr. Simmons himself blocking their exit from the pew. "Miss Warren," he said stiffly, his gray mustache twitching with displeasure. "A word, if you please." Ryder tensed beside her, but Penelope placed a subtle hand on his arm. "Of course, Doctor." Simmons cast a disapproving glance at Ryder before continuing. "It has come to my attention that you've resumed your practices, treating injuries, dispensing concoctions." "I occasionally offer herbal remedies to those who seek them," she replied evenly. "I make no claims of practicing medicine." "The Millbrook boy's hand," Simmons continued as if she hadn't spoken. 7 stitches, I understand. That's not an herbal remedy, Miss Warren. That's surgical intervention." Penelope felt blood drain from her face. Young Jamie Millbrook had come to her 3 days ago with a deep cut from a fishing hook. She'd stitched it cleanly, but obviously the boy had told his parents, who had told others. "The boy was injured and I helped him," she said, keeping her voice level despite the audience gathering around them. "As I would help anyone in need. Without a license or proper training, such help could be considered dangerous and irresponsible," Simmons replied. "We've discussed this before." "She has training," Ryder interjected, his voice carrying in the now silent church. "Those stitches in my hand are as neat as any I've seen, and the salve she provided has prevented infection." Dr. Simmons turned his cold gaze to Ryder. "Mr. Whitfield, you're new to our community, so perhaps you're unaware of Miss Warren's history." "In Philadelphia, I'm well aware of Miss Warren's history," Ryder interrupted, his tone hardening. "And I'm also aware that she helped Jamie Millbrook when you were too busy to see him, just as she helped during the influenza outbreak when you were overwhelmed." The doctor's face flushed red. "That boy died under her care." "That boy was dying before he reached her," came a new voice. Mrs. Millbrook stepped forward, her usual confidence visibly shaken by becoming the center of attention. "My sister's son was already blue when we brought him to Miss Warren after you said there was nothing to be done." A murmur ran through the congregation. This was apparently news to many. Miss Warren sat with him through the night, Mrs. Milbrook continued, her voice growing stronger. She eased his passing when no one else could, and she asked for nothing in return. Penelope felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected defense from a woman who had never publicly acknowledged her before. Furthermore, Mrs. Milbrook added, my Jamie would have a terrible scar and possibly a crippled hand if not for her quick work with those stitches. Dr. Simmons was away delivering the Peterson baby. What should she have done? Let him bleed. Dr. Simmons sputtered, but he was losing his audience. One by one, other townspeople began to speak up hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence about occasions when Penelope's remedies had helped them or their families. Her willow bark tea cured my headaches when nothing else would, admitted Mrs. Thatcher reluctantly. Fixed my horse's infected hoof when the livery said he'd need shooting, added old Mr. Grimes. Each testimony seemed to embolden others, and Penelope watched in stunned silence as the tide of public opinion began to shift before her eyes. Not completely, there were still plenty of suspicious glares, but enough to create cracks in the solid wall of hostility she'd faced for months. When the impromptu testimonials finally subsided, Dr. Simmons cleared his throat awkwardly. Be that as it may, he said, attempting to reassert control, proper medical practice requires proper credentials. Then perhaps, Ryder suggested smoothly, Willow Creek should consider itself fortunate to have both a doctor and a skilled healer. Different approaches, both valuable. The doctor opened his mouth, then closed it, evidently deciding this was not a battle he would win today. With a curt nod, he turned and made his way through the thinning crowd. Outside in the bright afternoon sunlight, Penelope found herself receiving cautious nods rather than the usual averted gazes. It was an acceptance, not fully, but it was a beginning. I believe I promised you dinner, Ryder said as they walked toward the hotel, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back. You did more than that, she said quietly. What happened in there? Why would you stand up for me like that? He stopped, turning to face her on the dusty street. Because it was right, he said simply. And because in my experience, people will follow the loudest voice until someone offers them an alternative. She studied his face, trying to understand this man who had upended her carefully isolated existence in the span of a week. There's more to your story than just wanting a change of scenery from Texas, isn't there? A shadow crossed his features. There usually is. After a moment, he continued, I left the Rangers after a town turned against an innocent man based on nothing but fear and rumor. By the time I uncovered the truth, they'd already hanged him. His jaw tightened. I couldn't stop it, and I couldn't stomach wearing the badge after that. I'm sorry, Penelope said softly. I recognized something in you that first day in church, he continued. The look of someone weathering a storm not of their making. I've seen too much injustice to walk past it when I have the power to speak up. His honesty touched her deeply. Well, speaking up has earned you the right to buy me dinner, at least. His smile returned, warming his eyes. I believe it has. The hotel restaurant fell silent when they entered, but under Ryder's steady gaze, conversations slowly resumed. They were seated by a window overlooking the main street, where the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty road. To new beginnings, Ryder said, raising his water glass after they'd ordered. And unexpected allies, Penelope added, touching her glass to his. As they ate, conversation flowed easily between them. Penelope found herself sharing stories of her training as a nurse during the war, her passion for combining traditional medicine with herbal remedies, and even, hesitantly, her dreams of someday opening a proper clinic where both approaches could coexist. Ryder spoke of his years ranging the Texas frontier, his childhood on a small ranch outside Austin, and his love of open spaces and honest work. He was a good listener, asking thoughtful questions that suggested genuine interest rather than mere politeness. You know, he said as they finished their meal, The Millbrook Ranch has been talking about building a proper bunkhouse with an infirmary. Ranching work brings its share of injuries and town's a fair ride away. Penelope raised an eyebrow. Are you suggesting something, Mr. Whitfield? Just thinking aloud, he replied with a casual shrug that didn't quite hide his intent. A skilled healer would be a valuable addition, especially one who doesn't mind using both traditional medicine and those herbal remedies of yours. And this skilled healer would work alongside the new head wrangler, I presume? Pure coincidence, he said, though his eyes told a different story. Though I will admit, the company would be a considerable benefit. The directness of his gaze made her breath catch. There was something happening between them, something that had been building since that first Sunday when he'd deliberately chosen the seat beside her. You barely know me, she said softly. I know enough, he countered. I know you're skilled, compassionate, and stronger than most men I've ridden with. I know you stayed in a town that treated you poorly because people needed help you could provide. And I know that, when you smile, really smile, it's something worth seeing again. Heat bloomed in her cheeks. You're very direct, Ryder Whitfield. Life's too short for anything else, he replied, reaching across the table to cover her hand with his. I'd like to see where this might lead, Penelope Warren, if you're willing. The touch of his hand sent warmth spreading through her. It had been so long since anyone had looked at her with anything but suspicion or disdain. Longer still since she'd allowed herself to hope for connection, for understanding, perhaps even for love. I'm willing, she said softly, but cautious. His thumb traced a gentle pattern on her skin. Then we'll proceed cautiously, starting with walking you home this evening, if you'll permit me. The walk back to her cottage was unhurried, the setting sun painting the Wyoming landscape in shades of gold and amber. They talked easily about small things, his plans for training the new horses at the ranch, her garden's progress, the approaching autumn. When they reached her door, Penelope found herself reluctant for the evening to end. Would you like to come in for tea? She offered, surprising herself. I would, Ryder replied, but not tonight. At her questioning look, he explained, if I come in now, the town will have fresh gossip by morning. Better to give them time to adjust to seeing us together in public first. His consideration touched her. You've given this some thought. I have, he admitted. I'm interested in more than just an evening's company, Penelope. That means doing this properly. He took her hand, his thumb brushing lightly over her knuckles. May I call on you Tuesday evening? I have the day off from the ranch. I'd like that, she replied, her heart quickening at the gentle pressure of his hand. Ryder lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, a gesture so old-fashioned and courtly that it made her smile. Until Tuesday, then. Penelope watched him walk back toward town, his tall figure silhouetted against the sunset. For the first time since arriving in Willow Creek, her cottage didn't feel like a fortress against a hostile world, but simply a home waiting to be filled with new possibilities. Over the following weeks, Penelope and Ryder settled into a courtship that became the talk of Willow Creek, though the nature of the talk gradually shifted from scandalized whispers to curious observation, and eventually, reluctant acceptance. They attended church together each Sunday, Ryder steadfastly taking the seat beside her. He called on her regularly, sometimes bringing small gifts, wildflowers, a book of poetry he'd found in the general store, a beautifully carved wooden box for her dried herbs. Penelope found herself opening her carefully guarded heart, allowing herself to trust again not just Ryder, but the possibility of a life where she wasn't defined by old mistakes and misunderstandings. The turning point for many in town came in late September, when a flash flood left several outlying homesteads isolated and injured. Dr. Simmons and Penelope found themselves working side by side in the makeshift infirmary set up in the church hall. To everyone's surprise, including their own, they made an effective team, with the doctor grudgingly acknowledging the efficacy of some of her herbal treatments for pain and inflammation. By October, Millbrook Ranch had indeed begun construction on their new bunkhouse and infirmary. with a small cabin nearby that Mr. Millbrook offered to Penelope as the ranch's official healer, a position she accepted with Ryder's encouraging support. On a crisp November evening, with the first snow threatening in the heavy clouds overhead, Ryder took Penelope riding to a bluff overlooking the ranch and the distant mountains beyond. "I've been thinking," he said as they stood watching the sunset paint the clouds in spectacular shades of pink and gold. "A dangerous pastime," she teased, comfortable now with the easy affection that had grown between them. He smiled, taking her gloved hands in his. "I came to Willow Creek looking for a quiet place to start over. What I found instead was you and a purpose I hadn't realized I was seeking." Penelope's heart quickened as he continued. "I know it hasn't been long," he said, his eyes serious, "but I've lived enough to recognize what matters when I find it, and you, Penelope Warren, matter more than anything I've ever known." From his pocket, he withdrew a simple gold ring set with a small pearl. "My mother's," he explained. "She always said it should go to the woman who taught me to see clearly." "And have I?" Penelope asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've taught me that standing up for what's right is never wasted, even when it seems hopeless. That healing comes in many forms. And that love can grow in the most unlikely soil." He took a deep breath. "Penelope Warren, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears blurred her vision as she looked at this man who had changed everything by simply taking a seat beside her when no one else would. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "Yes, I will." As the first snowflakes began to fall, Ryder slipped the ring onto her finger and drew her into his arms. His kiss was gentle at first, then deepening with a promise of the life they would build together. They were married on Christmas Day in the same church where they had first met, with many of the same people who had once whispered behind Penelope's back now filling the pews as guests. Even Dr. Simmons attended, presenting them with a medical reference book inscribed to both healers. Spring brought the completion of the infirmary and their cabin, a cozy home filled with the scent of herbs and the warmth of shared dreams. Together, they created something neither had expected to find in the small town of Willow Creek, a place where different approaches could coexist, where prejudice could give way to understanding, and where love could grow from the simple courage of sitting beside someone when they needed it most. And when their first child was born the following winter, a daughter with her father's storm-colored eyes and her mother's gentle hands, they named her Faith, for the quality that had brought them together and sustained them through doubt and difficulty. In the years that followed, the story of how they met became a favorite in Willow Creek, of the outcast healer who couldn't bear the looks in church, and the cowboy who took the pew beside her, changing both their lives forever.